February 11th, 1942, 16:45 hours, Ruffs Sands, Thames Estuary. Guy Maunsell stands on the deck of the tug Dapper, watching a 4,500-ton concrete monster settle onto the seabed 11 kilometers from the Suffolk coast. 4 tugboats, Dapper, Crested Cock, King Lear, and Lady Brassey, had towed this fortress from Red Lion Wharf, Gravesend, through an eventful 48-hour journey that began on the morning of February 9th. Almost 100 men stand aboard the structure. They embarked at Tilbury Docks days earlier, familiarizing themselves with a weapon system unlike anything the Royal Navy had deployed. Now, as controlled flooding fills the pontoon base, the fort tilts. 35 degrees. Maunsell's heart stops. The naval officer overseeing the operation flooded one side only, he would later record in his notes. The 51.2-meter-long by 21.2-meter-wide rectangular pontoon teeters, its twin 18-meter-tall concrete towers, each 7.3 meters in diameter with walls 9 centimeters thick, leaning toward catastrophe. 100 men, generators, fresh water tanks, ammunition, all sliding toward the Thames. Then the fort rights itself, settles level, rests on rough sands in 11 meters of water. 1645. HM Fort Ruffs becomes operational. The crew mans the 2 QF 3.75-inch anti-aircraft guns and 2 Bofors 40mm guns mounted on the steel platform connecting the towers. Within 30 minutes of grounding, they're ready to engage German aircraft. The impossible has just been built. Not a ship, not a building, a hybrid that shouldn't exist, a prefabricated concrete structure, assembled on land, floated out to sea, deliberately sunk, and now standing as a permanent island where empty water stretched yesterday. German pilots flying reconnaissance over the channel that week radioed reports their commanders didn't believe. Towers, multiple legs, gun platforms, rising from the sea itself. Britain had just deployed its first Maunsell sea fort. 3 more would follow by August 1942. But the real surprise, the forts that would destroy 22 enemy aircraft and approximately 30 V-1 flying bombs, were still being designed. The Army forts. 7 interconnected steel platforms supported on massive concrete legs, creating artificial islands that predated offshore oil platforms by 5 years and the U.S. Navy's Texas towers by nearly 20. This was proof that visionary engineering could defy the odds and change the course of a war. If you want to see how these incredible structures rewrote the rules of naval defense and saved countless lives, support us with a like. It truly helps us uncover more buried stories like this. And subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's delve into the remarkable civil engineer who made it all possible. This is the story of how a civil engineer with expertise in bridge construction solved a naval warfare problem, how reinforced concrete defeated the Luftwaffe, how Britain built science fiction to save London. The journey to HM Fort Ruffs began in October 1940 when the Admiralty commissioned engineer Guy Maunsell to design a prototype sea fortress. Maunsell was 56 years old, born on September 1, 1884 in Srinagar, Kashmir, to a military family of Anglo-Irish descent. Educated at Eastbourne College, he later studied civil engineering at the City and Guilds of London Institute, graduating with first-class honors in 1906. Unable to find immediate work, he supported himself by traveling Britain and selling watercolor paintings, an unconventional start for a man who would later shape Britain's wartime defenses. By 1940, Maunsell had spent 3 decades pioneering reinforced concrete construction. During World War I, he served as a commissioned officer in the Royal Engineers on the Western Front before being recalled in 1917. Back in Britain, he worked on concrete tugs and barges at Shoreham and contributed to the Admiralty's MN scheme, massive offshore towers intended to block German U-boats in the Strait of Dover. One survives today as the Nab Tower Lighthouse. Between the wars, Maunsell built a formidable resume. He worked at Rosyth Naval Dockyard, helped engineer the Falls of Clyde hydroelectric scheme, and designed steelwork for major bridges including the Kincardine Bridge in Scotland and Denmark's Storstrøm Bridge, then the largest in Europe. He came to believe that reinforced concrete, properly designed, could rival steel in durability while allowing faster, cheaper, and more unconventional construction. By 1940, the Thames Estuary had become Britain's most vulnerable artery. Every ship bound for London passed through it. The river was the nation's jugular vein. Cut it, and the capital would starve. German aircraft exploited this weakness by dropping magnetic mines, using the Thames as a nighttime navigation guide. Patrol vessels could not be everywhere, and low-flying aircraft slipped through the darkness with alarming ease. The river had become both Britain's commercial lifeline and a direct aerial corridor for the enemy. Maunsell's first proposal, a floating gun pontoon, was rejected as too expensive. Then France fell in June 1940. Germany now controlled the European coastline from Norway to Spain. Suddenly, cost mattered less than speed. The Admiralty demanded offshore forts immediately. Construction began in late 1941 at Red Lion Wharf in Gravesend. The design was radical, a vast reinforced concrete pontoon that doubled as a flotation base, topped by 2 hollow concrete towers divided into 7 internal levels. 4 floors housed up to 120 men. Conditions were austere but deliberate. Proper bunks replaced hammocks, and walls were painted a calming green to reduce psychological strain. The remaining levels contained mess facilities, operational rooms, generators, and freshwater tanks. Above the towers sat a steel platform mounting 2 QF 3.75-inch anti-aircraft guns and 2 Bofors 40mm guns. Fully loaded, the structure weighed roughly 4,500 tons. The fort was built entirely in dry dock, fully equipped before entering the water, Maunsell's masterstroke. Workers had solid footing, systems could be tested, and crews boarded during the tow for familiarization. Once positioned, the fort would never move again. Fort Ruffs was commissioned on February 8, 1942, towed the next day, and grounded on February 11th. A tense moment followed when uneven flooding caused the structure to tilt dangerously, but the error was corrected. The fort was operational within 30 minutes. 3 more forts followed: Sunkhead, Tongue Sands, and Knock John. After the Ruffs scare, responsibility for emplacement passed to engineer John Albert Posford, who sank the remaining structures without incident. By August 1942, the Thames was guarded by a permanent arc of concrete and steel. Life inside the forts was brutal. Damp seeped into everything. Winter storms shook the towers. Summer heat turned living spaces into ovens. Isolation wore heavily on the men, and the Thames forts would later record one of the highest desertion rates of the war. But they worked. German air crews, expecting only patrol boats, instead encountered fixed, radar-guided defenses. The surprise was total and deadly. The naval forts performed as intended through 1942, but by mid-year, Guy Maunsell had conceived something far more ambitious. The Admiralty's priority was stopping mine-laying aircraft along Britain's coasts. The War Office, however, needed sustained anti-aircraft protection for the Thames and Mersey estuaries against strategic bombing. These were different missions, requiring a fundamentally different solution. Liverpool had become a primary entry point for Atlantic convoys carrying American materiel, Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. German bombers approached from the west, using the Mersey's distinctive geography to guide them inland. In the south, the Thames Estuary lay directly on the Luftwaffe's flight path to London and the industrial Midlands. Mobile patrols and shore batteries were no longer sufficient. Maunsell's answer was radical. Army forts built not as single structures, but as interconnected clusters. Each installation consisted of 7 separate steel platforms, each supported on 4 reinforced concrete legs rising nearly 50 meters from seabed to deck. Together, they formed a distributed defensive system that mirrored proven shore-based anti-aircraft batteries, only placed miles offshore. 4 gun towers mounted QF 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns, arranged in a forward semicircle around a central control and accommodation tower. A fifth platform mounted Bofors 40mm guns to provide close-range defense. A sixth carried powerful searchlights for night tracking, while the seventh housed radar equipment for early warning and fire control. Elevated steel catwalks linked the towers, carrying power cables, fuel lines, and communications above the sea. The layout was deliberate. Dispersed gun positions prevented a single bomb from neutralizing the entire fort, while centralized control allowed coordinated fire. Crew strength varied over time, but wartime complements averaged around 250 men per site. Construction began in August 1942, even as the final naval fort was still being installed. The Mersey forts were built at Bromborough Dock on the Wirral, while the Thames installations, Red Sands, Shivering Sands, and the Nore were constructed at Gravesend by Holloway Brothers, the same firm responsible for the naval forts. Unlike the earlier pontoon-based designs, the Army forts relied on self-embedding foundations. The estuary seabed was not solid rock, but shifting sand, shingle, and mud. A floating base would have gradually tilted or drifted. Maunsell instead designed hollow concrete legs that provided buoyancy during towing. Once positioned, the legs were deliberately flooded, forcing them downward until their immense weight drove them deep into the seabed. Over time, natural sediment movement packed tightly around the foundations, increasing stability rather than undermining it. The towers were towed in pairs and lowered at carefully surveyed sites on the Great Nore Sandbank, Shivering Sands off Whitstable, and Red Sands near the Isle of Sheppey. The final tower was installed in December 1943, just 16 months after construction began, an extraordinary pace for structures of such scale. Each site followed the same installation sequence. The Bofors platform was erected first, providing immediate air defense for construction crews assembling the remaining towers. From the moment work began, the fort could defend itself. German reconnaissance aircraft observed the construction and photographed the installations. Luftwaffe analysts identified them as defensive structures, but underestimated their effectiveness. The forts looked unfamiliar, industrial, skeletal, unlike traditional fortifications. That unfamiliarity worked in Britain's favor. By late 1942, German crews flying toward London through the Thames Estuary encountered something entirely new: fixed, radar-guided anti-aircraft batteries sitting miles offshore where charts showed only open water. The first confirmed engagement occurred in early 1943, when a formation of Heinkel HE-111 bombers conducting a nighttime mine-laning mission ran into concentrated fire from Red Sands. Heavy flak forced the formation to climb and scatter. One aircraft was destroyed, the others jettisoned their mines into deep water to escape, rendering the operation a failure. Reports of fortified islands began appearing in Luftwaffe debriefings. Some crews assumed navigational error, others believed the structures were temporary. They were neither. Month after month, the forts remained, dominating the narrow aerial corridors dictated by the Thames itself. Unlike fighter aircraft, the forts required no fuel cycles or pilot rest. Unlike shore batteries, they could not be bypassed without abandoning the river as a navigational aid. They operated continuously. By late 1943, all Army forts on the Thames and Mersey were fully operational, forming permanent defensive networks in places where permanent defenses were never supposed to exist. By mid-1943, the tactical situation had shifted in ways Guy Maunsell could never have anticipated when he drew his first designs. Large-scale Luftwaffe raids on London had largely ended. Germany's failure in the Battle of Britain, combined with the catastrophic demands of the Eastern Front, drained the resources needed for sustained strategic bombing. Hermann Göring's inability to defeat the RAF in 1940 cost him influence, while the invasion of the Soviet Union plunged Germany into the two-front war its strategists had long feared. Aircraft, fuel, and, most critically, trained pilots were consumed in vast numbers over Russia. Britain was no longer facing mass bomber formations. Instead, the threat shifted to smaller, more insidious attacks. German aircraft focused on nighttime mine-laying operations, particularly in the Thames Estuary. The river carried such dense commercial traffic that even a handful of mines could close shipping lanes for days while minesweepers cleared them. Each closure delayed supplies and disrupted Britain's wartime economy. During this phase, the Thames naval forts scored one of their few confirmed surface engagements. A German E-boat penetrated the estuary defenses and attempted to lay mines near the shipping channels. Detected by radar, illuminated by searchlights, and engaged at close range, the vessel was destroyed in a brief but decisive action. The fort's true test, however, came in the summer of 1944, weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy. In retaliation for D-Day and the bombing of German cities, Hitler unleashed the Vergeltungswaffen, the so-called vengeance weapons. The V-2 ballistic missile was unstoppable once launched, striking without warning at supersonic speed. But the V-1 was different. Officially designated the Fieseler Fe-103, the V-1 was a pulse-jet-powered cruise missile, quickly nicknamed buzz bombs or doodlebugs by the British public. It flew at roughly 640 kilometers per hour at altitudes between 600 and 900 meters, slow and low enough to be intercepted. Fighters could chase it, anti-aircraft guns could engage it, and the Maunsell forts sat directly in its path. V-1 launch sites in occupied France and the Netherlands sent hundreds toward London. Each weapon was simple: a pulse jet engine, a gyroscopic autopilot, a fuel tank, and a heavy warhead. Once launched, it followed a fixed compass heading. When the fuel ran out, the engine cut off and the weapon fell wherever gravity took it. Britain responded with layered defenses. RAF fighters intercepted V-1s over the Channel. Coastal gun belts formed walls of flak. Barrage balloons forced the weapons higher, improving interception rates. But V-1s navigating along the Thames, using the river exactly as German bombers had since 1940, had to pass the offshore forts. Radar operators at Red Sands detected their first V-1 in June 1944. The signature was unmistakable: constant speed, fixed altitude, straight-line flight. No evasive maneuvers, no human pilot, just a mechanical path toward London. The engagement sequence became routine. Bofors 40mm guns opened fire first, their rapid transverse allowing early engagement. Streams of shells reached out toward the droning engine sound. As the target closed, the heavier QF 3.7-inch guns joined in, their timed airbursts filling the missile's flight path with steel. The first V-1, destroyed by the forts, detonated harmlessly over the estuary, scattering debris into the sea. From June 1944 through early 1945, V-1 engagements became a regular occurrence. Some days saw no launches, others brought multiple contacts within hours. The unmanned nature of the weapons simplified engagement decisions. There were no pilots to consider, no prisoners to take. These were flying bombs. Their predictability worked against them. The V-1's simple autopilot could not dodge or alter course. Fire control officers calculated intercept points using speed, altitude, wind drift, and ballistics. Maunsell's 7-tower layout, designed years earlier for manned aircraft, provided overlapping fields of fire that maximized kill probability. Operational records suggest the Thames Army forts destroyed roughly 30 V-1 flying bombs during the campaign. Combined with manned aircraft shot down earlier in the war, the forts achieved results far beyond their original mission. They had been built to counter bombers and mine layers. They ended up defending Britain against weapons that did not exist when their designs were finalized. Crews refined their procedures through experience. Radar detection typically occurred at 12 to 15 kilometers. Visual confirmation followed as the missile entered searchlight beams or dawn light. Coordinated fire from multiple towers saturated the engagement zone. One engagement in February 1945 illustrates the system at peak efficiency. A V-1 approached Red Sands shortly after dawn. Radar detection occurred at 12 kilometers. Visual contact followed minutes later. Two gun towers opened fire at 4 kilometers. A direct hit destroyed the missile 2 kilometers offshore. Total engagement time, 4 minutes. German planners never successfully adjusted V-1 routes to avoid the forts. The weapon's guidance system could follow a compass heading but lacked the ability to fly complex waypoints. Avoiding the Thames added distance, reduced range, and limited viable launch sites. Attrition was accepted. The campaign ended only when Allied ground forces overran the launch sites in the Netherlands and northern France in March 1945. For Britain, the calculation was simple. Every V-1 destroyed over the estuary was one that never reached London. The forts could not stop them all, but they reduced the toll. In military terms, they provided defense in depth. In human terms, they saved lives. Guy Maunsell's design philosophy grew out of a specific engineering tradition, an integrated approach to design and construction shaped by decades of large-scale concrete work. His background mattered. Between 1909 and 1914, he worked at Rosyth Naval Dockyard in Scotland, overseeing block-making yards and monolithic foundation construction. From 1924 to 1927, he engineered the Falls of Clyde hydroelectric scheme, completing the Bonington and Stonebyres power stations. In the 1930s, he designed steelwork for the Kincardine Bridge across the Firth of Forth and contributed to Denmark's Storstrøm Bridge, then the largest bridge in Europe. These projects taught Maunsell something most military planners overlooked. Water was not an obstacle to construction, it was part of the construction process. Cofferdams allowed work below the waterline. Flotation made it possible to move enormous structures. Concrete could be poured underwater. Structures could be built afloat and then fixed permanently through controlled flooding. The sea was not an enemy, it was a workspace. When the Admiralty sought offshore defenses, Maunsell approached the problem not as a naval architect, but as a bridge engineer. The question was not how to mount guns on ships, it was how to build stable structures in water. The operational requirements were severe. The Thames and Mersey estuaries demanded defenses that could operate in depths of 9 to 15 meters amid strong tidal currents, mount heavy anti-aircraft guns on platforms that would not pitch or roll, house crews for weeks without shore access, deploy within months rather than years, and consume minimal steel, already rationed for ships, tanks, and aircraft. Conventional solutions failed. Fixed platforms drilled into the seabed would have taken years and required equipment Britain did not possess in 1940. Anchored floating platforms could not provide stable firing platforms in fast-moving tidal waters. Mobile ships were already stretched thin in the Atlantic and North Sea and could not maintain constant station in the estuaries. Maunsell's solution relied on prefabrication at a scale rarely attempted at the time. Entire structures were built on land, under controlled conditions, using reinforced concrete, labor-intensive but steel-efficient. They were designed to float for transport, then sink deliberately into position. For the naval forts, the pontoon base served both as construction platform and flotation device. The entire fort was built on it, towed into position, and sunk in place. For the Army forts, hollow concrete legs provided buoyancy during towing and ballast chambers for controlled settling once flooded. The result was speed. From commission to grounding, Fort Ruffs took 16 months. The Army forts, from first construction to final tower installation, followed a similar timeline. Comparable shore fortifications or capital ships required years. Britain did not have years in 1940. The trade-off was permanence. Once sunk, the forts could not be moved. Maunsell accepted this. Static defenses that required no fuel, no propulsion machinery, and minimal maintenance were preferable to mobile platforms that consumed scarce resources and tied up ships needed elsewhere. A ship at sea is under constant mechanical stress. A concrete structure, once fixed, simply absorbs the environment. The Army fort's 7-tower configuration reflected another calculation: resilience. Functions were distributed. If one tower was damaged, the others could continue fighting. Guns, radar, power, and accommodation were separated but connected. Elevated catwalks, often assumed to be a weakness, simplified logistics. Power, fuel, and water could be centralized rather than duplicated across platforms. Weapon selection followed the same logic. The QF 3.7-inch gun was the British Army's standard heavy anti-aircraft weapon. Ammunition, spare parts, trained crews, and doctrine already existed. The Bofors 40mm gun was equally proven against low-altitude threats. Nothing experimental, nothing that strained supply chains. Building offshore also solved a fundamental limitation of coastal batteries. Shore-based defenses suffered from terrain masking and limited detection ranges across marshes and river bends. Placing forts 9 to 14 kilometers offshore eliminated these blind spots. Radar sat above coastal clutter. Gun platforms had clear fields of fire. Aircraft approaching along the river had nowhere to hide. This was not revolutionary technology, it was pragmatic synthesis, combining bridge engineering, naval construction, and fortification design into offshore structures that anticipated modern oil platforms by more than a decade. German planners expected ships and mobile defenses. Instead, they encountered fixed islands where islands should not exist. That conceptual shock created tactical surprise, and it lasted. The fort's effectiveness produced consequences that went far beyond simple kill counts. Between 1942 and 1945, they reshaped German operational planning for the Thames and Mersey approaches in fundamental ways. Luftwaffe bomber formations approaching Britain from continental Europe faced 3 defensive layers: RAF fighter patrols over the Channel, the Maunsell forts guarding the estuaries, and London's dense ring of anti-aircraft batteries. The middle layer, the offshore forts, created a unique tactical problem the Germans could never fully solve. Unlike fighter aircraft, which depended on airfields, fuel supplies, and pilot rest cycles, the forts operated continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never landed, they never refueled. They were simply there. Permanent steel and concrete obstacles, waiting. Ground-based anti-aircraft batteries could be mapped, studied, and avoided. The offshore platforms could not. They guarded water approaches that bombers relied on for navigation. The Thames, in particular, was the most reliable landmark in southern England, a wide, reflective ribbon visible from high altitude even at night. Abandoning it meant flying by dead reckoning over a blacked-out countryside, dramatically increasing the risk of disorientation or mission failure. At its mouth, the Thames Estuary narrowed to roughly 5 kilometers, forming a natural choke point. Aircraft following the river toward London had little room to maneuver. The forts sat directly across this corridor like toll booths on a highway, forcing bombers into predictable paths and engagement zones. Keeping the forts operational required constant logistical effort. Crews rotated every few weeks depending on weather and operational tempo. Supplies arrived by boat during narrow weather windows: food, ammunition, fuel for generators, fresh water, mail, and replacement personnel. The Royal Navy coordinated these operations through its Thames Estuary Special Defense Unit, maintaining communication with command headquarters at Chatham. Despite the challenges, logistics remained manageable. Each fort carried large ammunition reserves, hundreds of rounds per heavy gun, and thousands for the rapid-fire Bofors. Magazine spaces inside the concrete legs stayed cool and relatively dry, protecting ammunition from salt air corrosion. Living conditions, however, took a steady toll. Dampness permeated everything. Clothes never fully dried, metal rusted constantly. The smell of mildew was ever present. During winter storms, waves slammed into the towers, sending vibrations through the structure and echoing through the hollow interiors. Many men swore they could feel the forts sway in high winds, though engineers insisted the foundations made such movement impossible. Summer brought different hardships. Poor ventilation turned the interior spaces into ovens. Sunlight beating down on concrete and steel created greenhouse conditions inside. When weather allowed, men slept on deck, preferring open air to the stifling heat below. Isolation proved the hardest burden. Some men adapted, settling into the routines of watchkeeping and maintenance. Others struggled. There was nowhere to go. No shore leave during rotations, no escape from the same narrow corridors, the same faces, the same endless sea. Designer Guy Maunsell tried to mitigate the psychological strain. He specified gloss green interior paint instead of institutional gray, proper bunks instead of hammocks, and small comforts wherever possible. Even so, the Thames forts recorded one of the highest desertion rates in the British Army during the war. Some men went absent without leave during shore rotations and never returned. Still, the mission continued. After the Normandy landings in June 1944, German V-1 flying bomb launches intensified as Hitler sought to prove Germany could still strike Britain. The Thames forts soon engaged targets weekly. In one August 1944 day, 3 V-1s approached the Red Sands forts within 4 hours. The first was destroyed at 06:15 in morning twilight, radar contact at 11 kilometers, visual confirmation at 6, engagement at 4, destruction at roughly 2.5. The second arrived at 11:30 in broad daylight, allowing earlier engagement and a kill at 5 kilometers. The third came mid-afternoon. The crews were tired but experienced, engaging at maximum range and scoring hits on the second salvo. Each engagement consumed around 40 rounds of combined 3.7-inch and Bofors fire. The Bofors guns, with their high rate of fire, were more effective against small, fast targets, while the heavier 3.7-inch guns delivered the decisive blows. A single direct hit detonated a V-1's warhead. Through repetition, the gunners developed expertise. They learned to recognize V-1s by sound before radar confirmation. The distinctive pulse jet engine carried across water for kilometers. Fire was coordinated between towers, with one adjusting based on the fall of shot from another. This was not passive garrison duty, it was constant, demanding air defense. The Mersey forts saw less action. German attacks on Liverpool declined sharply after 1941 as Luftwaffe priorities shifted east and south. Still, the forts served as deterrents. German planners factoring U-boat operations into the Mersey had to consider radar detection and the risk of gunfire in shallow waters. The danger outweighed the reward. By early 1945, with V-1 launches halted after Allied advances into the Netherlands, the fort's role shifted again. They remained active through VE Day, guarding against mine-laying, naval raids, or a final desperate strike. The human cost of fort service was not measured in casualties. No fort was destroyed. Few men were killed by enemy action. The cost was psychological. Yet they stayed. They manned the guns. They tracked the radar. Every flying bomb destroyed over the estuary was one that never reached London. In a war of attrition, that reduction saved lives. Construction and deployment. 4 naval forts completed: Ruffs Sands, Sunk Head, Tongue Sands, Knock John, February to August 1942. 6 Army forts planned, 3 built in the Thames Estuary, Red Sands, Shivering Sands, Nore. 3 in the Mersey Estuary at Bromborough Dock, August 1942 to December 1943. Total construction time from Admiralty commission October 1940 to final tower completion December 1943, 38 months. Naval forts operational within 16 months of commission. Army forts operational within 16 months of construction start. Combat record: 22 enemy aircraft destroyed by Thames Estuary forts, 1942 to 1945. Exact breakdown by fort not recorded in available sources. Approximately 30 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, June 1944 to March 1945. 1 German E-boat destroyed by Thames naval forts during mine-laying operation. Naval fort specifications: displacement approximately 4,500 tons per structure. Pontoon base dimensions: 51.2 meters by 21.2 meters, 168 feet by 70 feet. Tower height: 18 meters or 60 feet above pontoon base. Tower diameter: 7.3 meters or 24 feet. Wall thickness: 9 centimeters, 3.5 inches reinforced concrete. Operating depth: 11 meters of water at Ruffs Sands, similar depths for other installations. Crew complement: approximately 100 to 120 men per fort. Armament: 2 QF 3.75-inch AA guns, 13,716 meter ceiling, 15 rounds per minute. 2 Bofors 40mm AA guns, 7,162 meter ceiling, 120 rounds per minute. Army fort specifications: 7 interconnected platforms per cluster. Leg height: 49 meters, or approximately 160 feet from seabed to platform deck. Crew complement: approximately 120 to 265 men, depending on operational configuration. Sources vary based on full versus reduced operational status. Armament: 4 QF 3.7-inch AA guns, 13,106-meter effective ceiling, 2 Bofors 40mm AA guns, searchlight tower, radar tower. Platform arrangement: 4 gun towers in a semicircular formation forward, 1 Bofors tower aft, 1 searchlight tower, 1 central control and accommodation tower. Post-war fate: all forts decommissioned late 1950s as threat environment changed and maintenance costs increased. Guns and operational equipment stripped 1956 to 1958. Nor Army fort demolished 1959 to 1960 after ship collision caused structural damage. Tung San's naval fort wrecked in a severe storm February 21 to 22, 1996. Sunk Head Naval Fort occupied by Royal Engineers August 18, 1967 to prevent pirate radio use. Multiple forts occupied by pirate radio stations 1960s to 1970s, including Radio Invicta, Radio 390, Radio Sach, and Radio City. Ruffs Sands, Fort Ruffs, claimed as Principality of Sealand, September 2, 1967, by Paddy Roy Bates, still claimed by the Bates family. Red Sands and Shivering Sands Army forts remain standing in the Thames Estuary as of 2025. Knock John Naval Fort remains standing with slight structural distortion from the seabed underscoring. February 11, 1942. After a terrifying 35-degree tilt during emplacement, the structure finally settles level. Guy Maunsell records in his engineering notes the successful placement of H.M. Fort Ruffs on the seabed at Ruff Sands. 83 years later, it still stands. Today, the fort flies the flag of the self-declared Principality of Sealand, claimed on September 2, 1967 by Paddy Roy Bates, a former British Army major turned pirate radio operator. Bates and his family defended their claim through decades of legal disputes, a 1978 armed takeover attempt by rival broadcasters, and repeated British government efforts to reassert authority. From a concrete tower in the North Sea, they issued passports, minted currency, and declared independence. The fort outlived its designer and acquired a second life no one in 1942 could have imagined. Guy Maunsell did not live to see this transformation. He died on June 20, 1961, at the age of 76, shortly after completing the Hammersmith flyover in West London, one of his final pre-stressed concrete projects. To Maunsell, the forts were never meant to be permanent. They were emergency wartime measures, ingenious, necessary, and disposable once the crisis ended. The Ministry of Defense shared that view. Officials assumed weather, corrosion, and tidal action would destroy the structures within a few years of the war's end. Instead, they endured. Red Sands and Shivering Sands still rise from the Thames Estuary, rust-streaked silhouettes against the horizon. Knock John remains standing despite erosion around its foundations. They outlasted the bombers they were built to destroy, the war that created them, the engineer who designed them, and the empire that ordered their construction. Their influence did not end with the war. Maunsell's prefabrication and offshore construction techniques directly informed the offshore oil and gas industry that emerged in the North Sea during the 1960s and 1970s. Fixed platforms followed the same core logic: build complete structures on land in controlled conditions, float them to position, then sink them precisely onto prepared seabeds. The first offshore oil platform was installed in 1947, 5 years after Maunsell's naval forts demonstrated the method at scale. Technology developed for war quietly enabled the post-war energy economy. Across the Atlantic, American engineers took notice. The U.S. Navy's Texas Towers, 6 offshore radar platforms constructed in the late 1950s and early 1960s as part of early warning defenses, followed similar design principles. Elevated platforms on fixed legs, isolated at sea, supporting radar installations where no conventional structure should stand. Maunsell's work was studied as precedent. Even during the war, the implications of his ideas extended beyond air defense. In 1942, Maunsell submitted a proposal titled Emergency Port Works, suggesting that structures similar to his forts could be adapted as artificial berths to supply troops landing on hostile shores. The concept caught the attention of the War Office and contributed to the thinking behind the Mulberry Harbors, vast artificial ports towed across the Channel and sunk off Normandy after D-Day in June 1944. Those harbors proved decisive. They enabled the flow of men, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition during the critical weeks after the invasion, when captured ports were unavailable. A plaque at Aramenses, inaugurated on June 6, 2000, bears the inscription Original Floating Harbor Concept, Mr. Guy A. Maunsell, C.Eng. FICE. Yet Maunsell's deepest legacy is not technical, it is philosophical. He demonstrated that military problems do not always require military solutions. A civil engineer, trained to build bridges and viaducts, solved a naval defense problem that had resisted traditional approaches. Concrete, not steel warships, defended the Thames. Permanence, not mobility, proved decisive in a mission defined by geography and time. Unconventional thinking defeated conventional threats. That principle remains relevant far beyond wartime engineering. When standard solutions fail, reframing the problem creates breakthroughs. When resources are limited, repurposing proven technologies can outperform expensive specialization. When time is short, accepting trade-offs, permanence over flexibility, simplicity over elegance, can make rapid deployment possible. After the war, Maunsell carried this integrated thinking forward. In 1955, he founded G. Maunsell and Partners in Westminster, pioneering pre-stressed concrete for major bridges. The firm expanded internationally to Australia, Hong Kong, and the Middle East before eventually becoming part of what is now AECOM. His insistence on designing structures with construction in mind, not just final appearance or function, reshaped modern engineering practice. Today, the forts have transcended their original purpose. Tourists charter boats to photograph the towers rising improbably from open water. Artists use them as canvases. Preservationists debate their fate, demolish them as navigational hazards, or preserve them as monuments to wartime ingenuity. Project Red Sands continues efforts to conserve Red Sands Fort as a museum, though corrosion, access, and cost pose immense challenges. Their cultural afterlife continues. In 2007 and 2008, Red Sands Radio broadcast from the fort in tribute to the pirate radio stations of the 1960s that once turned abandoned military structures into platforms challenging the BBC's monopoly. Though safety concerns later forced operations ashore, the broadcasts proved that the forts still captured imaginations more than 60 years after their construction. 22 aircraft, 30 flying bombs, 1 E-boat. These numbers alone cannot measure the fort's true contribution. Their deterrent effect, forcing German planners to reroute missions, accept greater risks, and confront fixed defenses where none should exist, does not appear in kill statistics. Their greatest impact was psychological. Concrete towers rising from empty sea violated expectation. Gun platforms appeared where doctrine said nothing could stand. German pilots initially reported the structures and were not believed. They seemed impossible. By the time intelligence confirmed their existence, the forts were operational and firing. That incomprehension was part of their power. They were engineering made alien. Concrete islands that should not exist. Structures that broke the rules of naval architecture and coastal defense. Solutions no one thought to look for because they lay outside accepted military thinking. Guy Maunsell built bridges to nowhere, and in doing so protected the arteries that kept Britain alive. The forts remain, salt-stained and silent, proving that sometimes the most audacious answer is the correct one. Sometimes victory comes not from the weapon you expect, but from the structure you build. Sometimes the strongest defense is the one your enemy cannot comprehend because it should not be possible. The impossible, once built, becomes permanent, and permanence, properly designed, is power.